Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Pública. This is the third part about the series of the relation between the Arabs from Algeria and the Spanish exiles during the 1930s and 40s, and how the currents of antifascism and anticolonialism were interlinked. In this third episode, I will talk about the time of liberation for the Spanish exiles, 1943, when they were liberated from the camps in Algeria, and from then on they were able to carry activities in the public sphere, like creating newspaper, organizing meetings, creating the political parties in exiles in order to appeal to the international community. So you have the socialists who formed the PSOE, the anarchists that were grouped under the CNT, the National Confederation of Labor, the Spanish Communist Party, and also members of the Republican Left and the Republican Union that coalesced into a same party. So when the Allies arrived to Northern Africa in 1942, they liberate the camps, and the Spanish start to go out in those years, end of 1942 and 1943. It was in June 1943 when de Gaulle led the French Committee of National Liberation that all the people of the camps were released. But in spite of that, many of them were seen as potential military assets for the army, and some took advantage of them as cheap laborers. But at last, the man had been released from the camps, could reunite with their friends, partners, and other relatives, and start a new life in Algeria. And considering that many had been socially involved even when they were prisoners, it does not surprise that once in freedom, with more time and energy to spare, they remain engaged in the political realm. Remember, these were people who had been deeply committed in the Second Republic of Spain from 1931. They had fought in the Spanish Civil War. They were forced to exile in 1939, so they had more than a decade of continuous experience in the political realm, organizing the defenses line, having different activities in order to provide with supplies to different people of the countries, organizing strategies, and so on. In that sense, people like Victor Ortega became the president of the section of Algiers of the Spanish Socialist Federation in Northern Africa, participating in many events, such as the May Day demonstration in 1946 and a range of political meetings. Similarly, José Muñoz, whom I spoke in previous episode, which was an anarchist of the CNT, was in Camp Moran and was one of the most committed in the creation of Grupo Exilio, the libertarian journal, and became the director of Solidaridad Obrera in 1946, which was the main newspaper of the CNT. It was released in Spain, in France, and in Algeria. In that sense, he was named Secretary of the Libertarian Youth of Africa and created the Círculo García Lorca, which was obviously a homage to the legendary poet who had been killed by the Francoists in 1936. According to José Muñoz, this political activism carried by the Spanish exiles in Algeria and the communitarian environment were fundamental for the Spanish to, quote, endure the defeat and the exile, end quote. In other words, it was not just following an aim to overthrow Franco from Spain, remove the dictatorship and restore democracy in their country, but also a part of the daily life. You have to try to guess how this exile, which had been fighting for many years, had been removed from their country, they were forced to exile, and now the day-by-day life, and after have been for more than 3 years in camps, they were going back to a kind of routine life. So they knew this kind of communal activities in order to keep in touch with what was happening in Spain at the same time that the Second World War was being fought. It was 1943. The Red Army had defeated the Nazis in Stalingrado, so it seemed that the Allies would win the war, but there was still 2 years left. And with all these considerations, there was an outburst of confidence among the Spanish exiles. In 1945, after the Soviets put the Soviet Union flag in the Bundestag in Berlin and defeated Nazi Germany, it was a moment in which fascism seemed to have been defeated. Mussolini had been removed from power, dictatorship in Italy was also ended in 1945, and some months later, Japan surrendered, and the Allies eventually won the war. So 1945, with all this consideration, was considered by the historian Louis Stein as the, quote, brief time of euphoria, end quote, for the Spanish exiles. After the end of the Second World War, it emerged a juncture in which the possibility to restore democracy in Spain was highly achievable. The hopes were high among the Spaniards in that sense. At that time, it was argued by Stein that the restoration of the Republic seemed to be both inevitable and imminent. But it was not just an idealistic view created by the Spanish to legitimize their demands. Remember that the Spanish were closely interlinked with what was happening around the world. They were reading newspapers. They knew how the developments in France, the United Kingdom, Soviet Union were going around. They were in Algeria, which was a French colony, so they had a continuous flux of information about how was going the war in the front. And even many Spanish exiles had gone to Paris to liberate the French capital under the Nazi occupation. In France, for instance, the Spanish were considered as heroes after thousands of them had sacrificed their lives in the battlefield, in the resistance, and even in the Nazi camps. That same years, even the French government conceded the status of refugees to the Spanish exiles for their support during World War II. So the role to defeating fascism was highly recognized even by the authorities that some years before had neglected them and they had trying to avoid their landing in Algeria. This time of elation was clear for those who lived through those years, like Consuelo Granda, who was imprisoned in a camp in France and emphasized how the Spaniards were estimating high regard by the French due to their role during the war. According to her, the Jolt of Bliss witnessed thousands of people in the streets, and it seems, quote, like a big holiday, a time of freedom, end quote. The international powers who had refused to support the Spanish Republic during the Civil War, I am talking about Great Britain and France, seem to be now in the side of the Republicans in 1945. Because that year, Great Britain, France, and also the United States signed the tripartite agreement to denounce Spain as a fascist regime, and the recently created United Nations denied its admission in the organization. So all seemed to go according to plan for the Republicans in exiles. Like, okay, now Spain is going to be isolated by the big powers. In the new world order, antifascism must be the most important point to draw the new kind of governments. This is very clearly seen in the constitution of the Fourth Republic, which was formed by a coalition of communists, socialists, and Gaullists. The party of Charles de Gaulle. Also in Italy, with the alliance between the communists and the Christian Democrats in 1945, because they had supported each other to defeat fascism, joining the partisans, and also in France, joining the resistance. There was a huge atmosphere in Europe that fascism could not have space anymore. Apart from Portugal and Spain, which were still governed by fascist authoritarian regimes, the rest of Europe was liberated in that regard. 1 year later, in 1946, the Spanish situation was even debated in the Security Council of the United States as a demonstration of how the Spanish situation was very important for the global community. For instance, speaking in the presence of the Secretary of the United Nations and with the support of France and the Soviet Union, the Polish delegate Oscar Lang remarked his plea to remove the dictatorship in Spain, emphasizing that, quote, Spain represents the global fascism and that Francoism is a danger for the United Nations. The relation of forces seemed propitious to push for the restoration of democracy in Spain. In order to seize this momentum, the exiles organized many activities to enhance their visibility within the local communities. At that time, the buzz of victory against the Axis powers was mixed with an anti-Francoist sentiment. In that paradigm, the exiles created newspapers, organized protests, created cultural activities, and took part in many different events to remain politically committed. Their aim was to overthrow Francoism, and they knew that their option was to engage directly in any kind of activity that could bring them near to their aim. They tried to appeal to the international community through the media while creating a local hub in Algeria. This was because fascism and Francoism were interlinked. Franco had been supported by Hitler and Mussolini, so the Spanish push to the international powers to keep isolating their homeland in order to finish with the Francoist dictatorship and bring back a republic. According to the historian Jean-Jacques Jordi, after World War II, Algiers became, quote, the short-lived anti-Francoist capital. This is an example of how deeply committed politically were the people living there. In that sense, the Spanish exiles had established an anti-fascist base, especially in the two more important cities of Algeria, which are Oran and Algiers. Their activism coincided with a new wave of a demand for independence carried by the Arabs from Algeria. This current had been quite consistent before 1936, as I explained in previous episode, but it had stopped until 1945. As I told earlier, the start of the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War had significant consequences in the movement for colonial liberation. Again, the Algerians expected that after the defeat of the Axis powers, their previous interest in the anti-colonial struggle would take priority. Antifascism took the main priorities since 1936 until 1945, so demands for independence were relegated to a kind of second importance. However, after 1945, on the one hand, the Spanish demanded the removal of Francoism and the Algerians' independence. In a post-war 1945, in which fascism has been defeated, it was the time for decolonization and for freedom. We see the current of decolonization that happened after that year in India, Algeria, Indochina, and many other countries of Africa, like Ghana, for instance, and so on. In that sense, the Arabs from Algeria were aware about the significance of the events in Europe and how those affect their political goals. Their relation with the Europeans, and in particular with the Spanish, started when they fought for the Republic, because as I mentioned, they were part of the international brigades, and 500 Arabs from Algeria had fought against Franco. In that sense, this relation continued when the exiles were held as prisoners in the Algerian camps, and in 1943, after all the Spanish exiles were liberated from the camps and decided to keep on their struggle against Franco, many were invited to take part on the struggle to defeat the Axis power. In December of that year, as an example of the relation between the Arabs from Algeria and the Spanish exiles, the French Communist Party and the Algerian Communist Party signed an agreement to accept the Spanish communists in this latter organization. That shows how from 1936 and across the 1940s there was a clear relationship between the Arabs and the Spanish Republicans, and this idea of anti-colonialism and anti-fascism were clearly interlinked. Although even they did not always relate their struggle, they were aware of each other's demands, and the geographic proximity and the role of the media certainly normalized the acknowledgement between both communities. It's important to note that during World War II, the Arabs from Algeria formed a significant part of the French army to defeat the Nazi Germany, as the Spanish had also done. As it had been said previously, they relate anti-fascism with anti-colonialism, believing that the end of the conflict would create an era of freedom. In that juncture, they expected to gain the independence from France. To legitimize their demands, the Arabs refers to the Atlantic Charter signed by Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. The document was written in 1941 and asserted the rights of people to choose their own form of government. Within that framework, the Arabs went to fight for France. In World War II, 134,000 Algeria-born soldiers were mobilized and an estimated 18,000 were killed liberating Europe. They had fought both in mainland France and in North Algeria. In fact, the historian Maria Concepción Ibarra has even argued that, quote, Algiers became the base of the French resistance against the Axis power. So we see how Algeria had a significant importance, being a kind of anti-Francoist capital, also an anti-fascist base. So all this struggle were related. At the same time, the Arabs were trying to push their demands for independence during the conflict. In 1943, the year when the Spanish exiles were liberated from the camps, Ferhat Abbas, the leader of the nationalist movement in Algeria, started to push again for the demands of independence that had been silenced in 1936. So you can grasp how these different struggles against Franco, against fascism in World War II, and for the independence were all enmeshed together, coalesced with the different struggles carried on by the people who were based on Algeria. In 1944, Germany was defeated in mainland France, and the Spanish, who formed La Nueve, which was a military allied company who liberated Paris, had a significant struggle there. And in that sense, Arabs from Algeria and the Spanish believe that they had earned legitimacy to ask France especially to help them in their further demands, because both the Arabs and the exiles had fought for France against Nazi Germany. So I will finish here the episode, and in the last one I will explain about how 1945, the time of euphoria, of illusion, became also the time of disappointment due to the outcome of the Algerian demand for independence and also the Spanish plea to remove Franco.